I'm joined by Dr. Impey, who has been working with Puresport on their brand new gel, which they're releasing, and also has a wealth of experience and very scientific background to him. Sam, just give us a bit of a précis of what your background is, what your particular specialisms are that you love.
Sure. It's always good to get to chat around all things carbs and endurance. So which is a sort of very short summary of my CV, I guess. Did my PhD in Liverpool John Moores, looking at how our bodies adapt to endurance exercise and how that can change depending on the amount of carbohydrate that we have in our body, and how we fuel our training around it. Did kind of a couple of postdocs after that. Again, same theme, looking at carbohydrate metabolism in the context of endurance exercise, both running and cycling. And then I've spent about 10 years working across a variety of professional sports, with sort of the bulk of that being in professional cycling, prior to founding a nutrition technology company and working for Puresport, to consult on their sort of scientific aspects of the company and also some of their new product development, the sort of first release of which has been the gels.
Brilliant. So yeah, you're from an external company and you've been advising Puresport on how to kind of make these gels and the science behind it and make sure that's all correct and based in real figures.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Brilliant. So in that case, I'm going to fleece you for all the information and we're going to go back to basics about fueling, because I think a lot of us, particularly those of us who've been maybe doing marathons for a long time, and we've kind of got a bit into the science and we think we know what we're talking about and we've listened to the podcast, but actually, how much do we really know and is it correct? So talk us through the basics of energy systems and fueling. What are we doing? What are these different energy systems that are working? And what are we trying to do when we're taking on gels, etc.?
So with energy systems and fueling, I suppose the sort of fundamental piece, at least when it comes to running, that I think most people probably underappreciate for most running distances. So certainly any of the short ones, but anything middle distance, 10K, half marathon, even marathons, are actually predominantly fueled for most people by them burning carbohydrates as an energy source. Once you get into the ultra marathons and you start going really long distance at much slower paces, that can shift. But for, I'd say probably, 95% of people, and the kind of runs that they do, the majority of the energy actually comes from carbohydrates. So even when we're doing that low and slow type training, certainly for the first 45 minutes to an hour or so, you'll probably be somewhere in the region of 50-50. So, or maybe even 60-40 of the energy coming from carbohydrates and then the rest of it coming from fat. And that changes over time. So the amount of carbohydrate will begin to slowly go down, and the amount of fat that contributes to energy production will slowly go up. But the bulk of most of our runs are going to be done and fueled with carbohydrates. And that's fantastic. They're the most oxygen efficient energy source, which I think a lot of people kind of don't really talk about all that often. They're sort of in the region of 10% more efficient as a fuel source than fat is. So it's much simpler for our bodies to convert the energy that's stored up in carbohydrates into energy for our muscles. I think I'd need to look it up, but it's something like 12 or 15 reactions in the sort of chemical equation that a molecule of glucose will go through to kind of release its ATP if it's aerobically oxidized, whereas fat will go through somewhere in the region of 100 reactions to liberate the same sort of amount of ATP. So just purely from never mind the fact that it requires more oxygen, but just, when you think about it at the sort of real basic mechanics of it, that's why it takes longer and is less effective to liberate energy from fat. And so what that really means for us as runners is really that making sure that we have a sufficient amount of glycogen, which is the body's store of carbohydrate, and most of that is stored in our muscles where we need it. Is making sure that we've got plenty of glycogen in the tank ready to go before we start our training, but also, making sure that we're potentially putting some in during training in the forms of gels or drinks, chews, whatever it is, and then making sure that we're recovering, re-topping up those stores again, to help our recovery processes, but certainly before we run again. So that's the kind of 30,000 foot view, I guess.
Just a quick clarify there. What is ATP? Can you tell us?
Sorry, yeah,
That's all right.
adenosine. A scientist in me fell out. Apologies. Adenosine triphosphate (ATP). That is energy. So that's the only thing that our bodies can directly use for cellular processes. And so that is what, for the most part, there'll be someone. There is a technical nuance to that around creatine phosphate as well. But yeah, so when I say that energy is liberated from carbohydrates and fat, what that energy does is it helps to our bodies to resynthesize ATP, which it can then use for muscle contraction.
Brilliant. So ATP is our kind of energy currency, as it were, and in whatever way we need to get that, there's different ways you can get it. The way we want to get it as endurance runners is ideally probably from carbohydrates because it's more
Yes,
efficient. That's what we're saying.
correct. Yes, exactly.
Thank you. So that's quite interesting because I think in the past I've heard, and I don't know whether others would find the same, but I feel like in a few years ago there was a lot of noise about fat oxidation and training fasted and training your body to use your fat first and having to not use carbohydrates. Now it seems to have completely flipped and we're going for a max carb model. Now, you've come from a cycling world. I was reading about Kona the other weekend. People were fueling with like, what was it, like 160 grams of carbs an
Yeah,
hour or something
yeah.
like that. So what's changed? Is it that we better understand things now, or I guess you kind of slightly touched on it a little bit, but just go back over that reason why we might want to use carbohydrates, and also, is there a limit? So if cyclists are using 160, why are we not looking at that? Why are we saying let's do 60 grams an hour?
Yeah, good question. So, I suppose the sort of lean towards a fat oxidation was probably driven by several things. I think there was some evidence, but my early PhD research, kind of looked at this as well, but there was some evidence that potentially you could maybe enhance the adaptations that you got inside the muscle, certainly at a cellular level, by training in a state of lower energy and lower carbohydrate availability, hence by definition using more fat as a fuel source. So there was potentially a bit of an adaptation piece there, and then as well, there was a concept that, well, if you can spare the muscle glycogen, the ethos around it was always to burn fat to save glycogen for when it's really important, the final stages of a race or whenever it is, that those sort of critical race moments. And so the idea was, could you spare that muscle glycogen by burning fat as a fuel source? The answer is you can't. So even if you do train your body to be hugely fat efficient, you will still burn whatever glycogen is in your muscles during exercise anyway, because it's almost like a preferential fuel for your body. But by becoming hugely fat adapted, you can slightly reduce that internal store of carbohydrate anyway. But essentially, it was theoretically a good idea, but it didn't really translate, and it also meant that for a lot of people, like, they ended up it increases your risk of getting sick and illness, injury, that kind of stuff. And it conceptually was a good idea, but potentially it was sort of somewhat flawed in its application, I think, unfortunately. So I personally sort of I think maybe we're swinging slightly too far the other way now. There's kind of a bit of a course correction. I actually think that there's probably a happy medium, being metabolically flexible. So the ability to use high amounts of fat at lower intensities and high amounts of carbohydrate at higher intensities, I think is hugely beneficial for any athlete. And that generally comes from, increasing your VO2 max and just accumulating training load as well. But it certainly seems that there are ways that you can maximize both those effects with diet as well. So, but potentially a different topic. But I suppose the reason that you're seeing, certainly when people talk about being on a bike, very high amounts of carbohydrate, several reasons that's kind of linked to. So for one, the kind of top performers at Kona, if you just look at their work output, often at or above sort of 300 watts, which for, puts you in a very large calorie output per hour. So there's a function of how they've trained, both how they eat around training, but also the kind of ability to sustain very large power outputs that sort of necessitates a very high carbohydrate oxidation rate. And total carbohydrate oxidation rate is different to exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rate. So those two things are very, very different. So whilst they are taking on 160, 180 grams an hour, they would be burning 2 to 3 times more than that if you measured their whole body carbohydrate oxidation rate. So what we actually take on is nowhere near the amount. It's about 30%. If you're really good at taking on carbs, it's probably about 30% of what your body actually uses. So no one can get close to replacing 1-for-1 burnt and ingested. It's just, well, there might be someone, but they'd be an absolute machine if they could. So, and they wouldn't be going that fast.
I was going to say, would like if is that the ultimate goal? Like, I know physically it sounds like it's impossible, but would that for an athlete be like the goal is to be able to directly?
No, it wouldn't. It wouldn't improve performance at all.
Okay, why not?
Well, because the idea is that you like, as you begin to burn a fuel source, you also get lighter because 1 gram of glycogen is stored with 3 grams of water. So you actually become more efficient as you go through the sort of duration of exercise. So you don't want to replace. The idea is to expend energy and to reduce the total amount of energy in the system. That's kind of the whole point. And so replace, even if you could. No, which you couldn't. But even if you could, replacing 1-for-1 wouldn't be beneficial in any way at all.
Okay, because the benefits of losing some of that sort of stuff in you,
Burning
as it
fuel.
were,
Yeah, exactly.
makes you more efficient. That's really interesting because
Formula One car goes faster as its fuel tank gets lighter.
That's a great analogy. That's really helpful. Thank you.
It's the same. It's the same thing in a human.
Yeah. Okay, so the idea is you just want to keep yourself from hitting that wall, basically.
Correct. Exactly.
So way when you're riding threshold with your heart rate, presumably you want to ride that line as low, like as close as you can without going over it.
Exactly. Yeah. And so what we don't want to do is, obviously, as you say, hit the wall. And so by taking on carbs, that sort of delays that response, essentially, is what we're doing. The difference between in your question as well, the difference between cycling and running is quite large from what we've seen. So I've seen data from, it's not published, but it's data that we've collected from ExoAnalytics, where we measured he's actually a professional Ironman triathlete, and so we measured his ability to uptake, digest, and burn carbs on the bike, and then we also did it on a treadmill. On the bike, it was kind of similar to how he'd be in a race situation. So he was well fed and hydrated. When we did it on a treadmill, what we actually get him to do was to go out and do 2 hours on the bike first, fasted, and then he came in and jumped on the treadmill, so that we were in a sort of closer state to having done a bit of work and being in a lower sort of total glycogen state when he got onto the treadmill to test his exogenous carbohydrate oxidation capacity. And what we found was really interesting is that on a bike, his tolerance, or his sort of uptake rate, was about 105 grams an hour. It's quite high, pretty good for he's a professional triathlete. I think he came top 10 in Copenhagen this year. But on the run, when we measured it, it was actually down closer to 60, 65. So even within the same athlete, the mechanics of cycling versus running, because in running you are physically oscillating, you're less stable as opposed to what you are certainly in a TT position. The mechanics, as well as the sort of different physiological state that he was in, actually contributed to quite a significant reduction in his ability, or his measured ability, to oxidize carbs from things like gels and that sort of stuff. So even within the same person, there can be a big difference from doing it on a bike to doing it on a run. And that's why, certainly at Puresport, when we talked about how to make the recommendations for these gels, apart from the fact that there was no published literature on female recreational runners, Even I didn't realize that until I started looking at it, which was outrageous. Um,
Oh, yep.
yeah. So apart from the fact there was no data at all, so we thought, right, well, we'll get some. We also thought, well, it's probably going to be pretty appropriate to test a sample of people representative of the community of people who are going to buy these gels, instead of saying, hey, there's this research that was done on people with massively high VO2 maxes and who run at, who do training runs at 18 kilometers an hour. That is great, and that's really informative to know what the limits of human physiology is, but it's not really applicable to the 99.8% of people who run half marathons and 10Ks and marathons in the world. So we thought, actually, and as I mentioned, there's no female data on recreational runners. So we thought, well, let's test that, look at that, and use that to inform the recommendations. And that's kind of how we got to that sort of 60 grams an hour, 30 grams every 30 minutes, which actually turns out is exactly what the recommendation is for you when we measured you as well. So that kind of gave us confidence that that sort of recommendation is practical and applicable for recreational runners, and that potentially some of the data on cycling should really only be used for cycling, and data on elite, super elite athletes probably only applies to elite and super elite athletes.
I think that's so helpful because, I mean, I'm like, you'll hear me bang on about the fact that there is, just nothing around female athletes really. Most of the testing in general, let alone recreational, is done on female athletes. So it's great to know that's been part of it. Did you see much difference between the male and female results at all in the end?
Not a huge difference. It was about the average was about 3 grams, about 3 grams an hour difference. So 48 to 51 between the females and the males. Is what we saw. The range was the sort of obviously the average is slightly lower. The range was slightly wider in the females as well. So there were some who were kind of in the high 30s, but whereas with the men, most of them were the sort of variance was a little bit lower. But not a kind of huge average difference when we looked at the kind of population amount, but sort of meaningful enough to go, okay, well, actually, we think that, when you see if you look at most fueling recommendations that are given out by supplement companies, the bottom number is 60 and it starts from there and goes up. And actually we thought that's more than likely going to be the sort of upper quartile. It's not the top number, but it's probably the sort of higher end of where most people want to go. And I think what we saw in the group of people that we looked at kind of reflected that quite nicely.
And do you think, just quickly before we go on to the gels in more detail, do you think that there is any effect of the place in a woman's cycle on the fueling requirements?
Really good question. From what I've seen, experienced in the research that I've seen, there's evidence that kind of carbohydrate oxidation in total may change a small amount through different phases of the cycle. Practically, I personally don't think that would necessarily change. So if you were doing a race, and one race, you 2 half marathons, for example, and one fell in the first the first week, 10 days of the cycle, and the second race a couple of months later fell in the last few days of a cycle. I wouldn't fuel those differently, is my example. So and the reason for that is I don't think there's this, I'm sure there'd be someone who disagrees with me on this, but for the value of my experience and from what I've seen with working with a lot of female athletes is that actually the sort of, yes, you may be able to detect differences in carbohydrate metabolism if you're measuring at a very high resolution, or if you're taking blood samples to look at free glucose in the blood, or like you could find a statistical difference. But a statistical difference doesn't necessarily mean that there's a practical difference in the application of how you would do it. So whilst I think you might physiologically see a statistical difference, that's very different to having a different practical application, if that makes sense. Um, and so I don't think the fueling would necessarily change based on kind of phase of cycle in the context of like a race, for example. Obviously, for for any females who are fueling, kind of being responsive to the symptoms that they face. So if no two cycles are necessarily the same. Menstrual cycles are the same length, and quite often what you'll see is that you get kind of symptoms that repeat in similar phases of it. So, um, kind of looking at, I think the phenomenal work that someone like Kirsty Elliott-Sale does out of Man Met Uni. Sort of I would be more responsive to the symptoms and sort of changing fueling in training based on how you feel kind of on that day, or if you know that there's a regular pattern that fits within your cycle where actually, today I know that today isn't a good day to take on a lot of carbs because it won't feel great in my stomach. If that's the case and you see that pattern regularly, then don't. But just kind of work it around that, and having that understanding of, if you're a runner, that sort of high fueling, a sort of potentially like a race simulation or a long run type fuel might be 60 grams an hour, but that doesn't mean you always fuel at 60 grams an hour. It can be lower than that if kind of if you're just doing kind of different style training runs. If you're doing a block of easier training, then you can lower that as well, of course. So it's just probably being a little bit responsive to the symptoms, as well as the sort of nature of training, and trying to balance those a little bit.
Yeah, so it feels like, and also with the kind of the Puresport's approach to how many gels to take an hour, you have a lot of scientific information out there, and it does have, like you say, statistical nuances to it, but actually you're kind of coming out of it and saying it's really not that complicated. Let's go with the kind of the average. That's, it's fine pretty much for everyone because everyone's so close to it. And again, with the female fueling, yes, there might be nuances, but actually it's not going to make a difference on race day to the point where you need to change your strategy, and being flexible is much more important.
Exactly so, yeah. And I think when we talk to a lot of the kind of people in the community of around Pure Sport, the biggest thing was, I don't take gels because I don't know I don't know if I should. I don't know when or how to take them. They're really odd numbers. There's 22, 24 grams in them. Do I need to take 1 3/4 of these to make, so there was a lot of kind of confusion around that. And so we really just wanted to, we thought that the benefit to the running community of simplifying it to a point to make it really accessible so that more people fueled their runs better was probably more important than being able to dial in the accuracy of the top 3% of performers.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
we felt really passionate about making it more accessible to help the majority of runners fuel better. And how could we distill that down into the simplest message possible? The gel is 30 grams, have one every 30 minutes. That gives you 60 grams an hour. Do that when you're running for over an hour, and you're going to be in a great spot.
And so on that note, should we, based on your research and your knowledge from past, should we be using gels on every training run? And what, how is that useful? Like, when might we not want to use a gel? And are we worried about kind of any problem with just taking on too much glucose and sort of insulin resistance over time or anything like that? Yeah, can you sort of talk?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, as a general rule, if you're running for longer than an hour, start thinking about taking on gels. It is where I'd really go for. If you're doing VO2 efforts, you're doing some VO2 max work, and the session's going to be 45 minutes to an hour, and a lot of it is going to be well above threshold. Maybe think about taking a gel in that session as well, but that's a much less common session. Intensity has a sort of exponential relationship with carbohydrate burn. So when you go above threshold, your carb burn doesn't double, it quadruples. So yeah, you very quickly burn through a lot of carbs once you start going above threshold. Anyway, so VO2 max work, if it's less than an hour, could be beneficial. from a sort of general fueling perspective and a general energy perspective, if you're running for longer than an hour, whether that's a long run or kind of aggregated intervals, whatever it is, then having kind of starting to think about adding gels into your workouts can be useful then. As I mentioned, you don't have to fuel at that kind of maximum amount. If you don't want to, particularly if it's, if you have good proximity to meals around it, so you're able to fuel well before and you get able to fuel well afterwards, then actually taking, a gel or two in a 90-minute run is probably going to be fine. The benefits that that's going to give you is around kind of workout quality. So your workout you'll maintain kind of better quality of work through, particularly in the last 15, 20 minutes of the session. You'll also kind of be in a sort of better energy status and will help to maintain that kind of blood glucose a little bit better as well. So those are the real benefits for it. We actually kind of, there's a little bit of evidence for it. It's actually done in ultra running, but anecdotally, what we see is that when people start to fuel their training runs a little bit better during the training, they begin to recover better. Honestly, I don't exactly know what drives that. But people just seem to recover better. That makes the next session feel easier. You get better quality again. That subsequently just like it compounds. And when you aggregate that over 25, 30 training sessions, funnily enough, it translates into a really good performance. So, that again, that's completely anecdotal. As I said, sorry, my dog's very passionate about carbohydrates. So it's completely anecdotal, but there's some evidence to support it in ultra running, with very, very high amounts of carbohydrate. But I think it applies at a lower level, but it's the sort of magnitude is scaled back a little bit, if that makes sense.
So just to wrap up, you've already said that carbohydrate is significantly more efficient as a fuel source. I think you said like 10%. That's more than we'd say for like a super shoe.
Give or take, yes, yeah. From
But I mean, if
sort
it's
of
4% for a Nike super shoe per
yes,
se.
yeah. So hang on, you've got me questioning this now. Is it 10% oxygen efficiency? I'm sure it is. I will let me look it up just to double check that, and I'll let you know. I'll let you know.
Enough that it's worth doing that before you spend money on crazy shoes if you're not fueling properly, right?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, like getting your fueling dialed in is will again the sort of compounding effects will have a much bigger long term benefit. That you don't. The thing is that it's a less immediate and less visceral benefit to a pair of super shoes. But as I say, the sort of compounding effects are definitely greater.
Yeah. So you can train better. Like you say, you get better quality towards the end of those training runs as well. I particularly was really interested with what you said about the VO2 max ones, because I wouldn't naturally think to take a gel for something like that. I would take gels for longer runs. I'm all on board with that, and pre-fueling for kind of that long, steady stuff. But actually for that exponential usage, I think it's really useful to know it's worth doing it for those hard sessions. And just to remember that you are setting yourself up for better training and therefore for better results if you can get that training block.
Yeah, there was there was a woman who came to one of the Puresport events that we did. She's a sprinter, and we were kind of having a bit of a chat, and she asked about whether she's like, oh, I've got could I use it in my sessions? And the sort of first response was, oh, I'm not sure, but like talk to me a little bit more about your sessions. And so she was saying that she would, a couple of days, or at least one of the days in a week would be something like hill reps, and then she'd go straight into the gym afterwards. And so the sort of total duration of the session gets out over 60 and quite often over 90 minutes. And I was like, oh, actually, yeah, when you phrase it that way, actually that's probably quite a good use case, because you've got a lot of work. Obviously she's sprinting, so very, very high above threshold, super VO2 max as well. And then you're kind of going into the gym afterwards. And I saw her I saw her at another event a couple of weeks later, and she was like, oh, I tried it with the Puresport gels, and she's like, I felt fantastic. My gym session got better because there was just a little bit more in the tank, and it was, I wasn't sort of helping that quality of work coming off the hill rep stuff. So which was, I mean, that was a real small use case and a great win from my side. But yeah, it was nice to see even in that context, when you add the sort of total duration of the session, it kind of became quite powerful to help her get good quality training at the back end of the day.
Brilliant. I'm really conscious you need to go. Sorry.
Yes, sorry, I do.
Just one very last quick question. Just to say, like, is there any concern about taking too many gels, that too much sugar over too long a time? Is there
Sure.
any?
Yeah. So eh, I- to my knowledge, I haven't seen anything like, if you're running, you're metabolically active, and you're quite likely to be, pretty insulin sensitive if you've been running for a while. So you'd have to take a lot of gels to, as I say, even get close to replacing that one-to-one burning for replacing. So you're always going to be, the fuel tank is always going to be going down. And as long as you're emptying the tank, refilling it, emptying it, refilling it, that will maintain really good insulin sensitivity. There may be some things about the long-term effects of oral use with sports foods and drinks. That's a kind of wider discussion. Again, I think there's no evidence to suggest that there are any issues. We see athletes retiring, particularly in the cycling world, who've had years of very high carbohydrate use, and they show there's no kind of issues. But I think it's good to have a healthy discussion about it, and just to keep challenging the ideas, and certainly make sure that we're looking after our bodies from a long-term health perspective as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. There's loads more I'd love to dive into, but that is plenty for now. And yeah, I really appreciate your time.
Right,